Donald Trump has indefinitely extended the ceasefire with Iran after a request from Pakistani negotiators and Iranian officials indicating they might not attend the scheduled peace talks. I'm joined now by Iran analyst, senior fellow at the Centre for International Policy, Negar Mortazavi. Negar, what is your read on these latest developments around the ceasefire and its extension?
First of all, it was another reversal by President Trump. Just earlier, he said, he threatened more attacks, and then he's again reversed and said that the ceasefire would continue, but with a caveat that the U.S. is not removing its blockade, which from the Iranian side, as they have also said publicly, is seen as an act of war. And so I think the Iranians are going to fight it. We're still waiting to see how the conclusion is going to be in Tehran, but this is just making the ceasefire more shaky and unstable. And again, with the mediation of Pakistan, the two sides maybe can come together and bridge the gap, but the gap seems to be really wide. And the goalpost also keeps moving.
Yeah, and that gap so wide to even get to the peace talks. Why do you think that latest round did not go ahead?
Well, it had to do with the disagreement on the Strait of Hormuz. So initially, the sticking point was Lebanon, because Iran wanted the ceasefire to be regional and to include Lebanon. And this is what the Pakistanis said the two sides had agreed. And then hours after the ceasefire, Israel attacked Lebanon in a massive attack, essentially a massacre on Beirut and other areas. And that made the ceasefire unstable, and the Iranians threatened to not join the first round of talks in Islamabad. And then finally, that point was removed. The ceasefire was imposed on the Israel-Lebanon situation. And then now it's the Strait of Hormuz. So Iran said that they would open the strait as part of the ceasefire. But the U.S. side, President Trump has said that he's not willing to remove his blockade, the U.S. blockade, on Iran. So this is now going to become a sticking point, and the Iranians have threatened that they wouldn't join the next round of talks. Now, ceasefires are messy, they're chaotic, so there will be disagreements or misunderstandings or pretending to not understand the other side's points, but there are also red lines, and I think this would be one of those sticking points that Tehran is not going to give up as part of their understanding of the ceasefire.
What are your thoughts on Iran's scepticism here, where they say, this extension of the ceasefire could just be buying time on the US's part for a surprise attack?
Well, who can read President Trump's mind, right? Because every time he's threatened, we have to look at it both ways. It could be potentially a prelude to another escalation. We've seen that happen. He threatened and then he made good on the threat. But it could also be him threatening last minute for leverage in negotiations, which is also something he's done when he threatened to end Iran's civilization. It was just hours before, another deadline. And then eventually it was seen as a form of leverage, a threat before negotiation. So it's either side, but there's such lack of trust for the U.S. in Tehran that they basically read everything as mostly an escalation or potential for more escalation. And the reason is they basically say, we negotiated with this administration twice, last year, and then in the middle of those negotiations came the war in June. And then this year again, we negotiated, came the war. And so now that the war is actually happening, there's very little trust left in Tehran, if any.
Who needs the war to end sooner, the US or Iran?
I think both. Iran didn't choose the war, really. The war came to them. They were attacked by the US, by Israel, two nuclear powers. But at the same time, they want to end the war on their own terms. They want to make sure, from their viewpoint, this is a continuation of last year's war. And so they want to end it so it doesn't come back. It's a permanent end. They don't want a situation where they end the war temporarily with a ceasefire and the war keeps coming back. On the U.S. side, I think the U.S. has more room to maneuver. They don't need this war. In fact, President Trump is getting a lot of pressure from the global community because of the economy. From the U.S., this war is very unpopular in the U.S. among the public. And so he can call it a victory and just exit the war. And I think he wants to exit the war, but he also wants to end it on his own term, to come out the absolute winner. He essentially wants the Iranians to surrender and say, we lose, you win, and we capitulate. And that's just not going to happen. It's not something the Iranians have done or are willing to do.
Did you expect this conflict to last this long?
Unfortunately, yes. It has become a war of attrition, and it's on unequal footing. Iran is the weaker party, the underdog, but they've also been able to escalate horizontally and open new fronts in the war. This is how they're fighting, they're defending. And then on the U.S. side, this is the world's mightiest army. The President Trump is the most powerful person in the world. So war can continue and continue, but it will be again U.S. blood and treasure that has been wasted in the Middle East, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. The experiences have shown to be failures after years and years, and that's why the war is very unpopular in the U.S. And the irony is that President Trump campaigned against the endless wars in the Middle East twice, and I would argue he won. If you listen to his comments against these endless wars, he makes so much sense. And then at the end of the day, he became the president to launch the next big, potentially endless war in the Middle East.